Alrighty, welcome back to James chapter 2, where we've been reading James's generalizations about the flaws, the character flaws, the evil character flaws and deeds of the wealthy. And this is a great example of why it's so important to look at everything within its context. James is going to go on to say some even more stern things against the rich as we continue reading later on in his epistle. I can almost quote it verbatim. "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your silver and gold have rusted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. It is in the last days you have stored up your treasure." Okay? And I'm just quoting verbatim from what we're going to read later in James. Well, so James is a hardliner against the rich, but if you only took these verses, you could conclude that just riches in general are evil, but James is going to make reference to a couple of Old Testament figures who were extremely rich and considered righteous, flat out very righteous by Scripture's testimony. One of them is Job. He'll mention that later on in his epistle. One of them is Abraham. Abraham believed God. It was reckoned to him as righteousness. And Job was declared by God to be the most God-fearing, righteous person on the earth in his day. And he was. Okay? And yet very wealthy. But in both these cases, and we know particularly from the evidence we have from the book of Job, that Job was a very generous, kind-hearted guy who took care of widows and orphans and handicapped people and so forth. And he didn't lay up his treasure on the earth. He was a rich man who laid up his treasure in heaven, like all wealthy people like us ought to be working on doing that. Okay? What James is really getting at in this passage we've been reading is, this thing about showing partiality to the rich. And anyone who's, in ministry, for that matter, any Christian, you need to be careful in this regard, showing partiality to the rich. There's nothing wrong with showing the wealthy honor, treating them like you would want to be treated. But here's what James says is wrong. If you're showing partiality and show special honor and favoritism to the wealthy at the expense of the poor. And we read the example that he gave there, okay? And so he characterizes the rich as the guys that take you to court and oppress you and blaspheme the name of God and so forth. So how foolish it would be just to be arbitrarily showing them, special privilege. Now, again, want to read where we left off last time in verse number 8, because this is so important, and this is central to the theme we've been reading all the way back through to chapter 1. If, however, you are fulfilling the royal law, or the law of our king, according to the Scripture, and then he quotes it, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," you are doing well. So do you want to do well? Do you want to do well in your relationships with others? Do you want to do well in your relationship with non-believers? Do you want to do well in your relationship with your spouse? Do you want to do well in your relationship with your children? Well, here's the rule, the law of liberty, the perfect law of the law of our King. Love your neighbor as yourself. Treat them like you want it to be treated. And you don't want to be, treated with partiality. You don't want other people to get better, treatment than yourself and be esteemed more highly than you. For whoever keeps verse number 9, but if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. And in this case, because he just talked about the royal law in the verse above, I think when he says you are convicted by the law as transgressors, he's still talking about that royal law. Obvious. That's the breaking of the law of love, to love your neighbor as yourself. If you do that, you're not going to show partiality. So it makes sense, and it also fits the context. But now James makes reference to a couple of Old Testament laws. Verse number 11, For he who said, quote, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not commit murder." Now, if you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. And even in that case, Paul wrote this in a couple of places, love fulfills the law. And if we love our neighbor as ourselves, we're not going to murder him. We're not going to steal from him. We're not going to commit adultery with his spouse. And so all those laws that we find in the Ten Commandments and elsewhere in the Old Covenant that deal with our relationship with others, they all fall under the ethical standard of love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? And so we want to be striving to obey that law in every respect, not just in one or two respects. The law of love should govern everything that we do. Okay? And how much better off we would be if we would be careful in every respect. Okay? And so now, coming down to verse number 12, so speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. Now, this is just a couple of verses after he made reference to make sure you keep the royal law. He defined the royal law as being love your neighbor as yourself. It just seems to make sense that that law of liberty, as I've told you before, is the same thing as the perfect law, the royal law, love your neighbor as yourself. If that's what he's telling us to obey and you'll do well, if that's what he's telling us to look intently at and make sure that we keep it, as perfectly as we possibly can, if that's the way that we are blessed, I'm just referring to scriptures we've already covered under this theme, then of course we're going to be judged by the law of liberty. Of course, if that's the second most important commandment, then of course we're going to have to give an account to God one day for how we did with that commandment. Okay, and so that's why I wondered out loud, even on this broadcast, why is this so rarely talked about? Why isn't this a major theme in our churches, from our pulpits, in our Christian lives? Why aren't we thinking about it more often? Loving our neighbor as ourselves. And the contrary side to all that, because we're going to be judged by that law, judgment will be merciless to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Where did James get that? Well, if you've been with me for a long time, you probably know. I'll wait till next time to tell you. So I'll see you next time.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.